I thought Brian had hung up after our lovely conversation. But when I heard his voice again, I realized the call was still connected. What I heard next destroyed everything I believed about my son. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in March, and I'd just finished my dinner alone at the kitchen table where I'd raised Brian for so many years. The phone had rung at 7:30, and seeing his name on the caller ID always made me smile. He was calling from his business conference in Dallas, sounding tired but caring as always. We'd had such a warm conversation. He asked about my day, whether I'd seen the neighbors, how I was feeling. He even asked if I needed anything from Dallas, which made my heart swell with gratitude for having such a devoted son. After everything I'd sacrificed to raise him as a single mother, moments like these reminded me it had all been worth it. "Love you, Mom, talk tomorrow," he'd said, and I heard what sounded like his phone being set down on a table. I was about to hang up myself when I heard voices in the background. Something made me freeze. The call was still connected. My finger hovered over the red button on my phone, but curiosity and a growing sense of dread kept me listening. That's when I heard Amanda's voice, clear as day through the speaker. "Did you tell her about the assisted living idea yet?" My blood turned cold. Assisted living? What was she talking about? Then came Brian's voice. The voice of the son I'd worked double shifts to put through college. The son I'd given everything to protect and nurture. Not yet. She'd fight it hard. But with our credit cards completely maxed out, we need that house money fast. The room started spinning around me. House money? My house? Amanda's response hit me like a physical blow. "Your mom's place has got to be worth $750,000 easily in this market. That pays off everything and gives us a fresh start." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. They were talking about my home, the place where I'd raised Brian, where his father and I had built our life together, like it was just some asset to liquidate. But Brian's next words shattered my heart completely. "I know, but she's my mother, Amanda." "Brian, she's becoming dead weight we can't afford to support anymore. Face reality." Dead weight. That's what my daughter-in-law called me. Dead weight. And then, the final betrayal that made my hands start trembling. "You're right. She'll be safer in professional care anyway, and we'll finally be debt-free. Stop feeling guilty. I'll handle researching the facilities. You just work on convincing her. She trusts me completely. I can make her think it's her idea." The phone slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the kitchen table. I sat there in the silence of my empty house, the house they wanted to steal from me, feeling like everything I'd believed about my son had just crumbled to dust. Brian thought I was dead weight. He was planning to manipulate me into giving up my home so he could pay off his debts. He was going to make me think warehousing me in some facility was my own idea. The boy I'd loved unconditionally, the man I'd sacrificed everything for, saw me as nothing more than a financial solution to his problems. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the kitchen where I'd packed his school lunches every morning, where I'd helped him with homework every night, where I'd celebrated every achievement and comforted every disappointment. They had no idea what they'd just done. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and they had no idea what was about to happen when they got back from Dallas. Before we continue, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and subscribe to Never Too Old channel. We're creating a community of incredible women who know that our best chapters can happen at any age. Now, back to the story. My name is Dorothy Sullivan. I'm 68 years old, and I live in Tampa, Florida, in the same house where I raised my son Brian as a single mother. That phone call changed everything. But to understand why what happened next was so devastating, you need to know who Brian used to be to me, and who I thought I was to him. I became a single mother when Brian was just 8 years old. His father left us for a younger woman, and suddenly I was alone with a little boy who kept asking when Daddy was coming home. I worked as a bank teller at First National, but one income wasn't enough, so I took a second job cleaning offices at night. While other mothers were tucking their children into bed, I was emptying trash cans and vacuuming carpets. Also, Brian could stay in his school and keep his friends. I remember those years so clearly. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning to pack his lunch, drive him to school, work at the bank all day, pick him up from after-school care, help him with homework, make dinner, and then head out to clean offices until midnight. I was exhausted constantly, but every time Brian smiled or showed me a good grade or scored a goal in soccer, I knew it was worth it. When Brian was in high school, he wanted to go to private school like some of his friends. The tuition was enormous for someone like me. But I couldn't bear to disappoint him, so I worked overtime every weekend for 4 years, picking up every extra shift the bank offered. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for lunch and mended my clothes instead of buying new ones. Brian got his private school education, and I was so proud watching him graduate. Then came college. Brian was smart and determined, and he deserved every opportunity. The state school would have been manageable, but he wanted to go to a prestigious university out of state. The costs were staggering, but I'd already sacrificed so much. What was a little more? I took out loans, worked holidays, and even sold my mother's wedding ring to help cover his expenses. 4 years and over $100,000 later, Brian walked across that stage to get his degree. I cried tears of joy in that audience, knowing I'd given him the foundation for a successful life. When Brian met Amanda during his first job, I was thrilled he'd found someone who made him happy. They dated for 3 years, and when they got engaged, they wanted what Amanda called a dream wedding. The venue alone cost more than I made in 6 months. But how could I say no? This was my son's happiness we were talking about. I dipped into my retirement savings and took on extra work to help them have the perfect day. After they got married, Brian and Amanda started looking for their first house. Real estate prices in Tampa had gotten crazy, and they were struggling with the down payment. When Brian asked if I could help them get started, of course I said yes. I gave them $50,000 from the life insurance money I'd received when my husband passed away. Seeing them in their own home, starting their family life together, felt like the culmination of everything I'd worked for. What Brian didn't know was that the life insurance payout had been much larger than he realized. My late husband had been very careful about our financial planning, and his policy was substantial. Between that money and my decades of careful saving from my banking career, I was actually quite comfortable. But I'd always lived modestly. I drove my old Honda until it couldn't run anymore, shopped with coupons, and kept my expenses low. Brian assumed I was living paycheck to paycheck on my retirement income, and I never corrected that impression. In recent months, Brian had been asking for more help. First it was assistance with a car repair, then help with utilities when Amanda was between jobs, then emergency money when their credit cards got too high. Each time, I said yes without hesitation. That's what mothers do, that's what love means. You help your children when they need you. I noticed Brian seemed more stressed lately, and our conversations had started focusing more on my expenses and my big house. Amanda would make comments about me rattling around in all that space, or mention how overwhelming it must be to maintain everything. They asked questions about my monthly bills, my insurance, whether I was managing okay with my finances. I thought they were being caring and concerned. I thought they were worried about their aging mother living alone in Florida. When Brian announced this business conference in Dallas and said Amanda was going to join him for a little vacation afterward, I even offered to pay for her flight. I wanted them to have some time together, and I knew money was tight for them. I was so proud of the man Brian had become, successful in his career, devoted to his wife, still calling his mother regularly to check on her. When friends at church would complain about their ungrateful children, I'd count my blessings for having such a loving son. The night before they left for Dallas, Brian came over to check on me and make sure I had everything I needed while they were gone. He seemed distracted and mentioned they had some big decisions to make about their future. I assumed he was talking about his career or maybe starting a family. I hugged him goodbye and told him how proud I was of him, how grateful I was to have such a wonderful son who still cared about his mother. 3 days later I was sitting in that same kitchen where I'd raised him, where I'd sacrificed so much to give him every opportunity, listening to him call me deadweight and plan to manipulate me out of my home so he could pay off his debts. That's when I realized that everything I thought I knew about my son, everything I believed about our relationship had been a complete illusion. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs I missed. The change in Brian didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, like watching someone you love slowly transform into a stranger. It started about a year ago when Brian lost his job at the marketing firm. At first, I was sympathetic. The economy was tough, and layoffs were happening everywhere. When he called to tell me the news, he sounded devastated, and my heart broke for him. Of course I wanted to help, however I could. "Mom, I hate to ask," he said during that first phone call after the layoff, "but could you help us with the car payment this month? Just until I find something new?" Without hesitation, I transferred the money to his account. $450 felt like nothing compared to my son's peace of mind. I told him not to worry about paying it back. That family helps family. But 1 month turned into 2, then 3, then 4. Brian was interviewing constantly, but nothing seemed to work out. Meanwhile, the requests for help kept coming. First it was the car payment, then it was utilities when their electric bill got too high. Then it was groceries when Amanda's part-time job hours got cut. Each time Brian called, he sounded more desperate and ashamed. "Mom, I'm so embarrassed to ask again, but we're really struggling. Could you help with the insurance payment? I promise this is temporary." What kind of mother says no to that? I kept transferring money, kept reassuring him that everything would work out, kept telling him not to feel bad about asking for help. By the end of the first year, I was covering most of their major monthly expenses. But something else was changing too. Brian's calls became less about catching up, and more about my finances. He'd ask questions that seemed caring on the surface, but felt different somehow. "Mom, are you managing okay with all your bills?" he'd ask. "That house is getting pretty expensive to maintain, isn't it? Property taxes, insurance, upkeep. It must be overwhelming." Or Amanda would chime in during family dinners. "Dorothy, you're rattling around in all this space. Don't you ever feel lonely here? It's so much work for one person." They started bringing up my age more frequently. Comments about how I was getting older, and how they worried about me living alone. Brian would mention news stories about elderly people falling at home or forgetting to turn off appliances, always with this concerned tone that made me feel like he was genuinely worried about my safety. "Mom, what if something happened to you and nobody found you for days?" he'd say. "We live 20 minutes away, but that's still 20 minutes too far if there's an emergency." I appreciated their concern, but it also made me feel diminished somehow. Like they saw me as fragile and helpless instead of the capable woman who'd raised Brian and managed her own life perfectly well for nearly 7 decades. The questions about my finances became more specific and frequent. Brian would ask about my retirement income, whether I was comfortable with my monthly budget, if I ever thought about downsizing to something more manageable. "Mom, houses like this are worth a fortune now," Amanda would say during visits. "Have you ever thought about what you'd do with all that equity? You could live anywhere, do anything with that kind of money." When I'd change the subject or give vague answers, they'd exchange these looks. Not angry looks, but calculating ones, like they were having conversations about me when I wasn't around. Then Brian started talking about planning for the future and making sure I was taken care of as I got older. He brought up things like power of attorney, and making sure all my financial affairs were organized in case I ever couldn't manage them myself. "Mom, I just want to make sure everything is set up properly," he'd say. "You've worked so hard your whole life, you deserve to have everything handled smoothly." It should have sounded loving and responsible. Instead, it felt like he was treating me like I was already incompetent. Like my mental decline was inevitable and imminent rather than theoretical and distant. The most uncomfortable conversations happened when they'd visit and walk around my house, making comments about how much space I had, how many bedrooms were sitting empty, how expensive it must be to heat and cool such a large place. "Mom, you could live like a queen in one of those nice senior communities," Amanda would say. "Imagine not having to worry about maintenance or yard work or any of that, just enjoying your retirement." When I'd protest that I loved my home and had no interest in moving, they'd back off quickly, but I could see the frustration in their eyes. Like I was being unreasonable or stubborn instead of expressing my preferences about my own life. The breaking point came 3 weeks before their Dallas trip. Brian called with what he described as a financial emergency. Their credit cards were maxed out. He still hadn't found steady work, and they were facing some kind of crisis that required immediate help. Mom, I hate to ask, but could you loan us $15,000? I know it's a lot, but we're really in trouble here. I promise we'll pay you back as soon as I get back on my feet. $15,000. It was more than I'd ever given them at once. But Brian sounded genuinely panicked. I transferred the money that same day. But something felt different about that conversation. Brian seemed less grateful and more entitled somehow, like he expected me to solve their problems, like it was my responsibility to bail them out of whatever financial mess they'd created. When I mentioned the transfer to my neighbor Ruth Martinez the next day, she gave me a look I didn't like. Dorothy, honey, how much are you giving them each month? She asked gently. When I added it up out loud, even I was shocked. Between the car payment, utilities, insurance, groceries, and emergency requests, I was supporting Brian and Amanda's entire lifestyle. They weren't living on Brian's unemployment benefits or Amanda's part-time income. They were living on my money. Ruth, they're struggling, I said, defending my choices. Brian's having trouble finding work, and they're young. I can afford to help them. Ruth's expression was skeptical. Dorothy, Brian's been looking for work for over a year. At what point does temporary help become permanent support? I didn't want to hear it. But her words stayed with me. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator and really looked at what I'd been giving them. The number was staggering. I was essentially paying for 2 households while living like I could barely afford one. 2 days later, Brian announced the Dallas Business Conference. 10 days away, with Amanda joining him for a vacation extension. They seemed excited about the trip, talking about the nice hotel and the restaurants they wanted to try. As I watched them plan their getaway, paid for with money I'd provided to help with their financial emergency, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, I started to wonder if Ruth might be right. I started to wonder if my loving, devoted son was taking advantage of his mother's generosity. I started to wonder if I was being used. But I never imagined how much worse it really was until I heard that phone conversation 3 days into their Dallas trip. I never imagined they saw me as dead weight. I never imagined they were planning to steal my home and warehouse me somewhere I didn't want to be. I never imagined my own son could be so cruel. That Tuesday evening phone call haunted me for days. Every cruel word kept replaying in my mind as I tried to process what I'd heard. She's becoming dead weight. We can't afford to support anymore. Dead weight. That's how my son saw me. Not as the woman who'd sacrificed everything for him, but as dead weight. The worst part wasn't even the cruelty of those words. It was how casually Amanda had said them, like stating an obvious fact, and Brian hadn't disagreed. He'd simply said, "You're right," and moved on to discussing logistics. I spent Wednesday walking through my house, really looking at it for the first time in months. This wasn't just property to me. This was where Brian had built blanket forts in the living room. This was where I'd nursed him through chicken pox. This was where we'd celebrated every birthday and milestone of his childhood. They weren't just planning to take my house, they were planning to erase our entire family history for their financial benefit. But what really destroyed me were the details of how they intended to manipulate me. She trusts me completely. I can make her think it's her idea. That betrayal cut deeper than anything else. Brian wasn't just planning to steal from me. He was planning to use my love for him as a weapon against me. He was going to exploit the trust I'd built through decades of unconditional support. I could picture exactly how he would do it. He'd start with concern about my safety, pointing to news stories about elderly people falling. He'd mention how worried he and Amanda were about me living alone. Then he'd bring up the financial burden of maintaining such a large house. He'd suggest it was time to simplify my life by moving to an active senior community where I could make new friends. And because I trusted him completely, I might have actually considered it. I might have convinced myself that maybe he was right. Maybe I was being stubborn holding on to this house. That's what made it so evil. Brian wasn't planning to force me into anything. He was planning to make me volunteer for my own exploitation by believing it was what a loving son wanted for his mother's well-being. Thursday morning, I called my neighbor Ruth Martinez and asked her to come over for coffee. I needed to talk to someone. Ruth, if I tell you something, will you promise to give me your honest opinion? I asked. I told her everything. The phone call, the conversation I'd overheard, the assisted living plan, the house sale. Ruth's expression grew darker with every detail. When I finished, she shook her head slowly. Dorothy, that's not family love. That's financial abuse. Financial abuse. Hearing Ruth say it out loud made something click into place. Brian wasn't helping or protecting me. He was systematically positioning himself to control my assets for his own benefit. Honey, what you're describing isn't the behavior of a son who cares about his mother, Ruth continued. It's the behavior of someone who sees you as a problem to be solved and an asset to be liquidated. Ruth was right. The pattern had been building for months. The questions about my finances, the comments about my house being too much for me, the suggestions about my age and capabilities. They'd been preparing the ground for manipulation. What are you going to do? Ruth asked. Brian and Amanda would be back from Dallas in 6 days. They were planning to start the assisted living pressure campaign immediately. They thought they had time to work on me gradually. They thought I was a helpless old woman who would gratefully accept whatever they decided was best for me. They thought wrong. Friday morning, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I got angry. Not sad or hurt or disappointed. Furious. The kind of anger that clarifies everything and strips away emotional confusion. I'd spent my entire adult life putting Brian's needs ahead of my own. I'd worked 2 jobs to give him opportunities. I'd sacrificed my comfort to pay for his education. I'd depleted my savings to fund his wedding and house down payment. Even recently, I'd been supporting his entire lifestyle. And this was how he repaid me. By planning to manipulate me out of my home so he could pay off debts from his own poor decisions? I'd raised him better than this. I'd taught him about honesty, respect, treating people with dignity. Somewhere along the way, those lessons had been forgotten. Brian had decided his financial problems mattered more than my autonomy, more than my right to make decisions about my own life. He decided I was dead weight. Well, if I was dead weight, then maybe it was time for them to learn how to carry their own load. Saturday morning, I sat at my kitchen table and really thought about my situation for the first time in months. Not as Brian's mother, not as someone who needed to solve his problems, but as Dorothy Sullivan, a capable woman with her own life and rights. I thought about my late husband and what he would say. He'd always been protective, always insisted I stand up for myself. Dorothy, he used to say, being kind doesn't mean being a doormat. People will treat you exactly as well as you insist they do. I'd forgotten that lesson. I'd confused being a loving mother with being an endless source of financial support. I'd mistaken enabling Brian's irresponsibility for helping him succeed. But I wasn't helpless. I wasn't confused or incompetent. I was a former bank teller who understood financial planning better than Brian ever would. I owned my house outright. I had substantial savings. I was completely independent and capable of making my own decisions. And I just overheard my son planning to steal all of that from me. As I sat there that Saturday morning, I realized something that would have shocked Brian and Amanda. I didn't need them. I never had. I'd been choosing to support them, choosing to prioritize their needs, choosing to make their problems my responsibility. But choices can be changed. By Sunday evening, I'd made up my mind. Brian and Amanda thought they were so clever, planning to manipulate a helpless old woman. They thought they understood the situation completely. They were about to discover just how wrong they were about everything. Monday morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Brian and Amanda had 5 days left in Dallas. 5 days before they returned to execute their plan to manipulate me out of my home. But I had 5 days too. My first call was to Thomas Walsh, a real estate attorney whose office I'd passed countless times driving through downtown Tampa. When I explained I needed to understand my legal rights regarding selling my property, he squeezed me in that afternoon. Mrs. Sullivan, since the house is titled solely in your name with no mortgage, you have absolute authority to sell it, he explained. You don't need anyone's permission or signature. It's completely your decision. That's exactly what I'd hoped to hear. How quickly could a sale be completed? I asked. With the right buyer and circumstances, as fast as a week. Cash buyers, no inspection needed, clear title. It's rare, but possible. I left his office with a list of reputable cash buying companies. The first one I called was Pinnacle Property Investors. We specialize in quick estate sales, Mrs. Sullivan, their representative explained. Could we evaluate your property tomorrow? Tuesday afternoon, a professional appraiser walked through my house, taking photos and notes. Based on recent neighborhood sales and the county tax assessment, they offered $750,000 cash with a 5-day closing. $750,000. The exact amount Brian and Amanda had calculated in their cruel conversation. We can close Friday if you're ready to proceed, the representative said. I signed the contract that evening. Wednesday morning, I opened a new bank account at a different branch, where Brian had never been. Then I visited 3 senior living communities Ruth had recommended. The third one, Sunset Manor Apartments, felt perfect. Clean, friendly, independent living with optional services if needed. We have a furnished 1-bedroom available immediately, the manager said. First month's rent can be paid today if you're interested. I wrote the check on the spot. Thursday was packing day. Ruth came over to help me sort through 4 decades of belongings. I kept photo albums, my mother's china, clothes, and a few pieces of furniture with sentimental value. Everything else could stay with the house or go to charity. Are you sure about this, Dorothy? Ruth asked as we folded my clothes into suitcases. I've never been more sure of anything, I replied. They want my house so badly? Let them explain to a new owner why they think they're entitled to live here. Friday morning, the closing took place at the attorney's office. I signed the papers, received the cashier's check for the net proceeds, and deposited it into my new account. $735,000. After closing costs. That afternoon, I moved my essential belongings to Sunset Manor. The apartment was small but bright, with a lovely view of the community garden. For the first time in months, I felt peaceful. Friday evening, I had one final task. I called a locksmith to change every lock on my old house. Then I went inside one last time and placed an envelope on the kitchen counter where Brian and Amanda would be sure to find it. The letter I'd written was simple and direct. Dear Brian and Amanda, if you're reading this, you know the house has been sold. I heard every word of your conversation on Tuesday night when Brian forgot to hang up his phone. I heard you call me dead weight. I heard you plan to manipulate me into assisted living so you could sell my house for your debts. The house sold for exactly what you calculated. $750,000. That money is now in my new bank account, where it will stay. I've moved somewhere I'm appreciated, not seen as a burden to be disposed of. Your belongings have been packed and placed in the garage. You have 30 days to claim them before they go to charity. I hope this lesson teaches you that underestimating people has consequences. You thought I was helpless dead weight. You were wrong about everything. Love, Mom. Saturday morning, I woke up in my new apartment, made coffee, and read the newspaper in my sunny kitchen. Brian and Amanda would be flying home that afternoon, expecting to return to their old life and begin working on their helpless mother. Instead, they'd find changed locks, a sold house, and the devastating realization that their financial problems were now entirely their own responsibility. I felt no guilt, only relief. For the first time in over a year, I wasn't worried about anyone else's bills or crises or poor decisions. I was free to live my own life, make my own choices, and spend my own money as I saw fit. Brian had called me dead weight. But as I sat in my peaceful new home, I realized he'd been projecting. He was the one who'd become a burden, constantly draining my resources while contributing nothing but stress and manipulation. Now he'd have to learn to stand on his own 2 feet. It was a lesson that was long overdue. Sunday afternoon, I was arranging my photo albums in my new apartment when my old phone started ringing. The caller ID showed Brian's number, but I didn't answer. He was probably calling from the airport, excited to get home and start working on his helpless mother. An hour later, the phone rang again. Then again. By evening I had 12 missed calls, and several increasingly frantic voicemails. The first few messages were confused. "Mom, our key isn't working. Are you okay? Call me back." Then came panic. "Mom, where are you? The locks are changed. There's an envelope with our names on it. What's going on?" Finally, devastation. "Mom, I read your letter. Please call me. We need to talk. I can explain everything." I deleted each message without listening to the end. Monday morning, Ruth called with an update. "Dorothy, your old neighbors saw Brian and Amanda at a motel on Dale Mabry Highway last night. They looked shell-shocked." "Good." Now they knew how it felt to have your security ripped away without warning. The calls continued all week. Brian left increasingly desperate messages about needing to work this out and find a solution. Amanda left crying voicemails claiming there had been a misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding. I'd heard exactly what they thought of me, exactly what they planned to do to me, in their own words. By Wednesday, Ruth reported that Brian had called her, begging for my new address or phone number. She'd refused, of course, but she said he sounded completely panicked. He kept saying their credit cards are maxed out, and they can't afford to stay in hotels much longer. Ruth told me. "He asked if I knew where you'd moved, said he just wanted to apologize." I'm sure he did want to apologize. Not because he was sorry for what he'd planned, but because he was sorry it hadn't worked. 2 weeks later, I was settling into a lovely routine at Sunset Manor. I joined the book club, started taking watercolor painting classes, and volunteered at the community garden. My neighbors were friendly people who valued conversation and companionship, not what they could get from me financially. Ruth visited regularly with updates from the old neighborhood. Brian and Amanda had tried to contact the new owners of my house, demanding to know how to reach me. The new owners had threatened to call the police if they didn't stop harassing them. Brian had also shown up at Ruth's door multiple times, sometimes with Amanda, sometimes alone, begging for any information about where I'd gone. Ruth said he looked terrible, unshaven, exhausted, desperate. "He told me they're facing bankruptcy," Ruth reported during one visit. "Said they were counting on your house to solve their financial problems, and now they don't know what to do." I felt a brief flicker of the old sympathy, quickly replaced by anger. They'd been counting on my house to solve their problems? Problems they'd created through their own irresponsibility and poor decisions? A month after their return from Dallas, I decided to drive by my old neighborhood, not to see Brian and Amanda, but to see how the new owners were treating my former home. The house looked beautiful. Fresh paint on the shutters, new flowers in the front beds, children's bicycles on the driveway. A real family was making happy memories there now, not planning to exploit elderly relatives for financial gain. As I drove away, I felt a deep sense of peace. My house was in good hands. My money was secure. My life was my own again. 6 months later, Ruth brought news that Brian and Amanda had divorced. The financial pressure and stress of their situation had destroyed their marriage. Brian had moved back in with his father in another state, and Amanda had returned to her parents. The last I heard, Brian was working 2 part-time jobs trying to pay off their debts. No more business conferences. No more vacation extensions. No more living beyond their means on someone else's generosity. He was learning what it meant to carry his own weight, instead of calling his mother dead weight, while depending on her support. As for me, I was thriving. At 71, I was more independent and content than I'd been in years. I had wonderful friends, engaging activities, and complete control over my own finances and decisions. I'd changed my will, leaving everything to the animal shelter and a scholarship fund for single mothers. Brian would inherit nothing, just as he'd planned for me to have nothing when he warehoused me in assisted living. Sometimes I thought about calling him, maybe trying to rebuild some kind of relationship. But then I'd remember his voice saying, "She trusts me completely. I can make her think it's her idea," and the impulse would pass. Trust, once broken so completely, can never really be repaired. Brian had taught me that family isn't defined by blood, but by how people treat you. My real family now consisted of Ruth, my neighbors at Sunset Manor, and the friends I'd made in my new life. People who saw me as Dorothy Sullivan, intelligent, capable, worthy of respect, not as dead weight to be managed and manipulated. I was exactly where I belonged, living the life I'd chosen for myself. And Brian? Well, Brian was finally learning to solve his own problems without using his mother as a safety net. It was a lesson that was long overdue, and one I was happy to have finally taught him. So, that's my story. I'd love to hear what you think. You believe I was too harsh, cutting off Brian completely, or did he get exactly what he deserved for calling me dead weight? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe if you want to hear more stories like mine.